Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. I know that it is very early at certain parts of the world and it's a bit late at the other parts of the world. I'm very happy to see you all. And I'm very pleased and honored to see Dr. Fathali Moghaddam today with us. Thank you very much for joining us. And thank you for agreeing to be part of this chat. As usual, this seminar is organized by a Student and Early Career Committee of Division 48. And this time we are doing it in collaboration with the BRIR consortium of psychological researchers from the Global South. The topic is relevant to both, and I really hope that we will have a great time and lots of questions later on during this seminar. As usual, I will first just briefly introduce our speaker, although I'm quite sure that all of you are familiar with him and his work. Dr. Fathali Moghaddam is a professor in the Department of Psychology at Georgetown University. He was born in Iran, educated from an early age in England, and worked for the United Nations and McGill University before joining Georgetown University in 1990. He returned to Iran in the spring of the revolution in 1979, and he was researching during the hostage-taking crisis and the early years of the Iran-Iraq war. He has conducted experimental and field research in numerous cultural contexts and published extensively on radicalization, intergroup conflict, human rights and duties, and the psychology of globalization. Dr. Moghaddam was the editor of Peace and Conflict Journal of Peace Psychology, and he has received numerous recognitions for his academic work. Today, he will be talking to us about one of his recent publications, How Psychologists Failed, We Neglected the Poor and the Minorities, Favored the Rich and Privileged, and Got Science Wrong. It was published in 2022 by Cambridge University Press. So, Professor Ali, thank you very much for joining us. Welcome, and you are now free to introduce the audience and to tell us more about your publication and your work in general.
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be with you, and I look forward to our discussion. I thought I'd talk for about 25, 30 minutes, and then we could have, if the whole topic is going to be covered in about an hour, we could have half the time at least to discussion, because I'm very eager to have your comments as well and your insights. The book, How Psychologists Failed, is provocative, and it's designed to be provocative. It's in the tradition set by earlier researchers who wrote critically about mainstream psychology. There have been lots of them, and some of them from the Global South, but mostly mainstream psychology continues to ignore these criticisms. And one of the things I thought we'd discuss is that tradition of mainstream psychology simply ignoring what critics have to say. I wrote this book because I became more and more concerned about a number of issues. One is the enormous wealth concentration and resource inequalities that is increasing around the world. This wealth concentration has been documented very rigorously by economists. For example, Piketty has written extensively on this. Other economists have written on this, about the concentration of wealth in fewer and fewer hands, as well as how the bottom 40% or so are falling further behind. So this seemed to me something that psychologists should be attending to. Why? Because poverty and relative deprivation have a huge impact on behavior. And yet, one of my favorite courses to teach is general psychology. And I'm sure those of you who have taught general psychology know when you get one of those blockbuster, glossy books that introduce psychology, And that in the United States, now those books cost $200, $300. There's no mention whatsoever of poverty. Issues, topics such as intelligence are discussed without any reference to poverty. The fact that poverty has a huge impact on people's behavior is completely ignored. So this bothered me a great deal. And one of the reasons I wrote this book, How Psychologists Failed, is really to try to highlight this issue of the impact of poverty on behavior. By the way, the provocative title was suggested to me by one of the reviewers of the book. It wasn't my idea. I had a title like Rethinking Psychology, but this reviewer said a better title would be How Psychologists Fail. And we have failed by ignoring the issue of poverty, ignoring social class. A second issue that has bothered me all these years of being a researcher in psychology is the assumption in psychology that all behavior is causally determined, and that in order to be a scientist, you have to assume what Aristotle called efficient causation, that X will inevitably cause Y. And if you take that position, of course, then you necessarily have to take the position that free will of any kind doesn't exist because all behavior is causally determined. And then we get into these arguments about, well, ultimately, all behavior is determined by biochemical processes, and psychology will be reduced to biochemical processes. A position that I regard as total nonsense, but it's a position that you inevitably get to if you take the materialist perspective and the causal perspective and assume that all behavior is determined causally. It seems to me clear that this is not correct, and we take it not to be correct. For example, in the law courts, if I go into the law courts and argue that I robbed the bank because of all these causal factors, my deprived childhood, the heat of the day, all these things, the jury will still find me guilty. They will say, no, your behavior is not causally determined. You actually, we assume, have some measure of free will. Anyhow, this causal assumption underlies mainstream psychology, and it's a problem. It's a problem because it neglects the normative account of psychology. It neglects the idea that much of our behavior involves us intentionally selecting to do one thing rather than another, and the power of the normative system to influence us. In influencing us, it is not causing us to behave in a particular way. It is providing us with different opportunities, and we're our ultimate deciders on much of our behavior. Now, some behavior is causally determined. For example, if I ride my bicycle and hit my head through a fall and lose memory, well, the neural damage is causally determined. That's different. So it seemed to me that psychology is actually of two kinds. One is causally determined, and the other is normatively regulated. And again, I thought it's worth coming back to this issue, and I wrote this book in order to highlight this issue as well, particularly because when we think of the issue of poverty, poverty is a very strong context. Those who are poor those who have to worry about where their next meal is coming from, those who have to worry about how they're going to pay the rent, those who have to worry about whether they have to sleep outside because they can't pay the rent or they have to find a car to sleep in. That is a very strong context, and that shapes behavior greatly. Of course, in the global South, I think there's more awareness of this issue. In the United States and many Western countries, there is this idea that there is a meritocracy, and we actually end up in the social hierarchy depending on our motivations and abilities. And in this book, How Psychologists Fail, I systematically go through the major topics that are in the general psychology texts, including motivation, including personality, including intelligence. And I discuss how each of these topics is highly influenced by poverty, and how those who are more affluent basically have more choices. Let me come back to this issue of meritocracy, because, of course, it is central to much of capitalism. It is central to much of democratic societies of the West. And important in these societies is the idea that what we get, what we achieve, is really dependent on our own individual motivations and our efforts and our talents. This is obviously the case in, this assumption is obviously the case in the education system. In the education system, people take tests, and it's assumed that the results of those tests reflect their individual motivations and talents. IQ is discussed in the same way. IQ is discussed as if it is something independent, something self-contained in the individual, that the context is irrelevant, that we can test your IQ irrespective of who you are, where you come from. And that IQ is something that is objectively measured through our tests. And that IQ is what is really reflected in the tests in education system and tells us where you're going to end up, in which university, etc. Well, in this book, I review evidence showing very clearly that, for example, where you end up in the education system, the best predictor is often the income of your family. Now, this is very obvious in the United States because of the tuition levels, enormously high tuition, and increasingly we have this problem of in the selective universities of teaching to very rich people who can afford those tuitions. But this is also important in the South, in the countries of the South, lower income countries, because it's absolutely true that a very talented person from a rural part of, for example, Pakistan, could get to a university, but it turns out to be much, much more difficult for that person than if she or he were to be from a middle-class family in a major city. So these contextual issues are really missing from mainstream psychology. Similarly, the issue of personality is discussed as if the major traits that we focus on are somehow independent and they function without any reference to context. So in the chapter on personality, I discuss how the personality that you display is going to be hugely determined by your level of affluence. If you happen to be an extrovert and you happen to be very rich, well, you can show your extroversion in very obvious ways. But if you happen to be an extrovert and you happen to be very poor, and your job is, for example, to clean the floor or wash toilets or something like that, the probability of you being able to show your personality in the work context, at least, is going to be very limited. Affluence and power give you the opportunity to display certain types of personality traits that poverty do not allow you to display. And these kinds of issues are completely ignored in mainstream psychology. Similarly, I discuss the issue of motivation, which again in mainstream psychology is treated as an individual difference variable, that people are motivated to different degrees. And of course, this links up to the idea of meritocracy, that some people are highly motivated. They're the ones who get ahead. And motivation is seen to be something that is determining our position in the status hierarchy. Of course, motivation, individual motivation is important, but if you happen to be born in a very poor family, the probability of you, irrespective of your motivation, individual motivation, the probability of you actually rising up is very limited. And in the United States, in the UK, and in some other countries, that motivation is going to be less and less influential, because we know that social mobility has stagnated. Social mobility is higher in Scandinavian countries than it is in the US. So again, there are some issues that need to be dealt with in mainstream psychology that are totally ignored. They are decontextualized. Similarly, I discuss mental health. And in the mental health arena, one of the very powerful movements at the moment is the positive psychology movement. The positive psychology movement is particularly strong in the United States and in some other Western countries. I don't know how much influence it has gained in the South and lower income countries, but it's certainly very influential in the US. And usually, as I discussed back in 1987 in a paper on the three worlds, usually what becomes influential in psychology in the United States is then exported to the second world and third world. So I expect positive psychology is being exported. Now, one of the issues about positive psychology is this link between positive psychology and the American dream. Positive psychology is really the American dream in mental health. It's this idea that you can think yourself out of your mental health problems. You can think positively and be happy, and you will get out of those mental health problems. Of course, what they completely ignore is the link between poverty and mental health. And in this book, I review that evidence, and I cite some of these people in positive psychology who are forced to admit that when you look at mental health, it has a link with poverty. If you are born poor, if you are born in a poor family, the possibility of experiencing depression is much higher. So again, this is a very important area of psychology linked to poverty and social class. and it's being ignored. Now, why is it being ignored? Well, it seems to me that to get to the answer to this, we have to go back to the history of psychology. And we have to go back to psychology since the Second World War. And we have to look at the Cold War and the anti-communism that was very strong in American society and American academia. Anti-communism was very strong in American academia, and it still is very strong in American society. One of the worst things you can be called in American politics is to be a socialist. And this has had an effect on American psychology. There's no doubt. American psychologists have shied away from looking at social class. The term social class is taboo. Now, fortunately, in my research for this book, I found a number of very promising psychologists who now have the courage to explore social class and its impact on behavior. So I've reviewed some of this literature in the book, and I think gradually it may be the case that we're going to get beyond this sort of knee-jerk reaction to anything related to social class. But there's no doubt that the fear of being called a communist has been very important in forcing researchers not to look at poverty and not to look at social class, even though when you look at the evidence, it's clear that poverty and social class have huge impact on behavior, different aspects of behavior, from intelligence, personality, motivation, mental health, etc. Now, the other issue that comes up is people saying, well, wait a minute, in this book, you really don't deal with race, and you really don't deal with gender, and you know, these are other categories that you're ignoring. And my response is, yes, I did ignore them. Why? Because, first of all, I'm very aware of the research on intersectionality, but it seems to me that poverty is a more profound and deep factor in influencing social behavior. It goes right across all the ethnic groups. By the way, I don't like the term race as a term in psychology, because the differences we're dealing with are actually ethnic social constructions. If you look at the genetic differences between groups, they are almost nonsensically minimal. People are called African American or white or Hispanic based on phenotype, not genotype. Anyway, I've ignored or set aside ethnicity and gender because I see poverty as more pervasive, more profound in its impact. And it seems to me poverty is the key when we try to explain what is going on politically with these populist movements. Think about the backlash we have had over the last 20 years or so. I've written books like The Psychology of Dictatorship and Threat to Democracy because of this backlash. The backlash is mostly coming from whites, and it's mostly coming from poor whites. And the reason I believe they are mad is because they feel as if they're being ignored. Now, that's a whole separate discussion, but a poor white in a situation in capitalist societies, in socialist, whatever society they're in, a poor white seems to me to have a lot in common with a poor black. A poor female has a lot in common with a poor male. The poverty is the common characteristic. And the poverty creates such a strong context. And in this book, I have critically discussed a lot of research, including in the area of cognition, how poverty impacts our thinking, how poverty impacts the way we make decisions. So much research on this right now. One of my favorite involves a field study where the researchers looked at farmers before and after the harvest. And they found that they were assessing them in decision-making ability. They found that before the harvest came in, when the farmers were waiting for money, they had a lack of money, they were under stress because they didn't have enough money. Their decision-making was poorer than after the harvest when they had money. There's lots of research showing the same trend. There's experimental research showing that when you put people, individuals in situations of stress, resource stress, they make poor decisions. So there is cognitive research, there's research on mental health, there is research on personality, on intelligence, all moving in the same direction, showing us that poverty is a very powerful context and that we should pay attention to poverty. If you pick up one of these mainstream psychology texts, one thing you'll notice is now there is a lot of attention to ethnicity, or what they call race. There is attention to ethnicity, and there is attention to gender differences. What there is no attention to is the issue of resource differences, poverty, social class, and the enormous gap between the haves and the have-nots. I see this as the challenge of the 21st century. I mentioned that economists have really mapped this out very well. Thomas Piketty's book is one I would start with. There's another one by Atkinson, and they all map out the same trends: increasing concentration of wealth, more and more wealth in fewer and fewer hands. There's also a very interesting statistic that Oxfam publishes every year. This statistic is about the number of individuals who have enough wealth that is equivalent to half the world's population. So half the world's population right now is about 4 billion. How many individuals does it take for them to have enough wealth equivalent to 4 billion? It turns out that it's something around 20 now. You can look this up under Oxfam's estimates of wealth concentration. We've gone back to the age of the pharaohs. We're now in a situation where a few individuals own as much wealth as billions of people. And this trend is even accelerating. It's not declining. The poor are not catching up. The rich, the super rich, are not getting less rich. They're getting more rich. One of the interesting exercises I do to look at this trend is to look at the spending habits of the super rich. And what I find is that, for example, buying yachts. How much are the most expensive yachts? Well, when I started this about 20 years ago, the most expensive yachts were, 40, 50 million. Now, the most expensive yachts are over $1 billion. Can you imagine $1 billion for a yacht? And of course, they have their private jets, etc., that are just as luxurious. So what's happening is that this enormous concentration of wealth is increasing. At the same time, the poor are falling behind. Poverty has a huge impact on behavior. It impacts our decision making, our cognitive style, our personality. It impacts our performance on intelligence tests, and it impacts the way we behave in education. Yet, despite all this, poverty is completely ignored in the mainstream psychology texts and in mainstream psychology journals. Fortunately, as I mentioned, there are now a small number of psychologists who are attending to this issue, and I wrote this book to try to highlight their work, as well as to highlight the whole issue of inequality and injustice. Okay, I'll stop there. It's about half an hour, just a bit, 35 minutes, and I hope we can have a discussion now.
Thank you very much for this presentation. It was really impressive. I actually took a lot of notes, and I would have some questions to ask, but before I actually proceed, I would like someone from the audience to ask some of the questions. I can see here we have a mix of both Division 48 and ABRIR members. So please, if you have any questions or comments, ask now, or if you don't want to ask, you can also put your question in the chat and I'm gonna read it. Any comments?
Yeah. Well, if no one else has one, this is Robin Freeman from the Broward Ellens Institute. Hello.
Hello.
Alma and all. Thank you so much. What you described about this concentration of wealth and its catastrophic effects fits very well with our research where we talk about authoritarian stress condition, which is sort of the public psychology of shared narratives.
Yes.
And that the more simplistic and hierarchical the systems are, which is typical of civilization, they just like it does exactly what you say. So I was so glad to hear that because it completely corroborates our observations, and dealing with it seems so essential. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd love it if you would send me a link or two to your most recent work. That would be great because I would use it both in teaching and in writing. That's wonderful. One of the things I didn't mention is the discussion about what we can do, about this concentration of wealth. Is there a limit? Where is it going to get to? And why should we attend to it at all? Maybe some people might argue, well, this is not bad. It's sort of part of capitalism. And if some individuals are amassing more and more wealth, well, why not? What's wrong with that? So that's one perspective, but another perspective is represented by a book called The Great Leveler. The Great Leveler. And the argument in The Great Leveler is quite disturbing. This is Scheidel's book, The Great Leveler. He argues basically that the way capitalism is set up, the only path for coming to a situation where the rich will be ready to share some of their wealth, and by the rich, I mean the super, super rich, the only way we're going to get to that point where the multi-billionaires are willing to share is through catastrophic war. He calls it the Great Leveler, something like the Second World War. He argues that when there is an enormous catastrophic war, it acts like a leveler, because the super rich see that their world might come to an end, and in order to stop that, they become willing to share some of their wealth, and then higher taxes for the rich are accepted. But that is a very costly way to solve this problem. I think we'd all agree we don't want to end up in World War III.
Thank you. I see one question here in the chat. Why do you think no work being done by psychologists in the Global South?
Well, this is a fascinating question, because I like some of you, I mean, I worked in the Global South for a while. I went back with the revolution in Iran. I was there working for 5 years. And during that time, I wrote about psychology in low-income countries and the challenge of what we have to do. It is very challenging. First of all, there is a status hierarchy. So, for example, even in a country like Iran, which is very anti-Western, if you happen to have a degree from a Western country, you are at a higher status. And for you to come back to that country now and to say, well, actually, the psychology of the West is very good, but we need to change it, to adapt it for ourselves, and it's really not, it has major flaws. You're kind of shooting yourself in the foot. So Western trained psychologists in the Global South will very seldom be critical of Western psychology. It's something that goes against their interest. The other issue is that in most countries of the Global South, this status hierarchy means that if you can publish in Western journals, you get ahead. There's a huge bias for Western journals and Western book publishers. And of course, Western journals and Western book publishers are not going to typically publish things that are critical of the West. Although it is very subtle, there is a censorship process that some of us have come across. So there are all kinds of subtle reasons why in the South it's very difficult to publish things that are critical of mainstream psychology. Another issue is the arrangement of the power system in psychology across the world. I mentioned back in 1987, I wrote a paper in American Psychologist called The Three Worlds of Psychology. And I described how, if you look at power relationships, the United States is the first world of psychology. The United States produces more psychological knowledge than any other nation. It exports its psychological knowledge to the second world, which is made up of Europe, the USSR, China, etc., or Russia and China. It used to be the USSR. And then the lower income countries in South America, in Africa, in Asia, they import psychological knowledge from the United States and Europe and they are the third world of psychology. So there's a power relationship, and it's often very subtle, but it's powerful. And it influences how we do things. When I was in Iran after the revolution, I attempted to publish a social psychology text that would deal with some of these issues, but unfortunately, I wasn't given permission to publish such a text. So one of the other issues in the global South is that psychologists there are often facing censorship that's quite strong coming from the government in different ways.
I think I see one arm raised, and I also see here two questions in the chat. So maybe I will read these questions from the chat, and then we can proceed to the question from the audience, direct one. So Richard asked, what do you think of liberation psychology? And then we have a question from Diane. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing your names. Yes, generally those with more wealth may be more likely to be conservative in the USA for tax breaks and control power, yet interesting that our country's Trump is appealing to the very powerful for the tax gain and control, while those with low incomes are being exploited and are voting against their own self-interest with respect to the SS minimum wage, etc. In supporting Trump, it didn't help the Democrats that Hillary Clinton referred to those in rural areas and without college degrees as deplorable. We must look at this psychological status dynamic. Can this be sent on a question if appropriate? I mean, I'm not American, so like I've just asked questions. Okay.
Sorry, can we go back to the first question? I didn't catch that. Could you repeat the first question?
Yes. What do you think about liberation psychology?
Liberation psychology, yes. Well, as far as I know, there have been several different movements that we can refer to as liberation psychology. The most influential one, I think, is in Latin America. And it seems to me extremely constructive, and it has led to some very, very interesting work, applied work, particularly in mental health. So I'm very thrilled about that psychology. Now, there's also what's called indigenous psychology, and I'm less thrilled about indigenous psychology, but I think liberation psychology should also be exported from the global South to the global North. I think that would be great if we could have more liberation psychology in the global North. That would be wonderful. The closest thing to that in the global North, I think, is currently community psychology. Some community psychology in North America is close to liberation psychology in South America. Now, with respect to the second question, I think there is a lot of research that relates to this issue that you're referring to, of what people in system justification theory would refer to as false consciousness. So there is a lot of research on that. And it gets to be very tricky because we're assuming in this discussion of false consciousness that some people are unable to perceive the reality of their own group membership, class membership, and they don't see their class interests accurately. So they end up voting for an authoritarian figure like Trump, and by voting for him, they are going against their own interests. That seems to me to be a solid argument But in order to solve that problem, psychology has to come back to this issue of consciousness and social class and pick up the research on poverty and its impact on cognitive style and cognitive decision making. So there is research related to this, both in system justification theory and in cognitive psychology, but we have to pick it up and make it more extensive.
I see the follow-up question in the chat, but first, Caitlin, because her hand has been like up for a while.
Sure, thank you. Hi, Dr. Moghaddam.
Hello, Caitlin.
So yeah, I really appreciated your discussion of how we address this issue in a capitalist society and how difficult that is when so many people are profiting from things working the way that they do. And I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit on how maybe you think about the intersection of this failure to discuss sort of the impact of poverty in that context and our tendency, especially in the US, to sort of use this biomedical model or understanding of sort of the etiology of mental illness.
Yes, yes. Well, the medical model of mental illness is very convenient for a number of reasons. One is that it is individualistic and reductionist, so it takes everything to be inside the individual. And also it fits in with the American dream idea that anyone can make it if they have the right characteristics and motivation. And of course, Jane can't make it because, well, you know, medically, she's just not suitable. You know, there's something wrong in her brain or some hormonal imbalance. And now that discussion completely ignores the context in which Jane grew up and the idea that she grew up in extreme poverty. She didn't get the right kinds of food. Her parents were completely stressed out. They were both working and couldn't put enough food on the table. They have environmental issues where they're living. So there's a whole host of things that are completely ignored. And then we say, oh, well, there's a hormonal imbalance in Jane. And that's the, you know, the solution is very simple. You get some kind of a drug and you administer it. And she comes across, you know, she comes over once a month for an injection or something. And this is a completely reductionist, context-independent approach. Now, I'm not ignoring the fact that there are individual differences in our biological makeup, and I'm not ignoring the fact that some of us will have biological problems or mental health problems that are strongly influenced by biological factors. But the impact of context and poverty is huge, and we're completely ignoring that. And we're adopting this individualistic strategy. Now, community psychology, as I mentioned, is closer to liberation psychology in America. And I think some community psychologists are now working on the right path. But of course, this doesn't go in line with the mental health system and the mental health model adopted by the insurance companies.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I see Professor Montiel has her arm up, and I also see that Richard had a follow-up question on what do you think about indigenous psychology. So however you want to point, maybe Professor Montiel can also ask her question now. Just unmute yourself.
Sorry, thank you, Anna. Hello, Ali, and everybody. Good morning
Hello,
here in the
Tina.
Philippines. Good evening,
Wonderful
good
to see you, Tina. Can you hear me?
Yes, very well.
Oh, good, good.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes,
Is it
yes.
clear? Okay. Just I have two things that are unrelated. The first is that we have a team in Ateneo de Manila that's doing a social psychology book. We're revising it, meant for the Global South. And we have a chapter on poverty. And we just had a discussion on that chapter a few days ago. And
Great.
the debate was on, should we present a cultural understanding of poverty or a structural understanding? And more or less that came out also now that something like indigenous psychology is more like a cultural understanding of poverty. Liberation psychology is more like a structural
Yes.
understanding. And so we decided to do both, to present both, just so that people will see there's a distinction in the lenses. And then second, well, we also decided to do an agentic lens, so that it's how people change the system of poverty, the psychology of that, rather than how people are victimized
Yes.
by that. So these are things that we're talking about. My second is really a personal question for you. As you know, I am one of your admirers, and you're my role
Very
model.
kind.
Your ideas are really like, oh, okay. How did you, and you are a very visible person and thinker in mainstream psychology. So how did, with these ideas, how did you rise in mainstream psychology?
Well, I think you're being very kind. First of all, thank you very much. I don't see myself as being in mainstream psychology. I do try to publish through mainstream journals and publications, but one of the interesting things that we could, I think, collectively think about is how mainstream psychology manages to ignore some issues that we discuss, for example, poverty, and then take up some other issues that it likes. So in a sense, mainstream psychology has this selective function, that it selects things. For example, your book, Social Psychology, it might take up some aspects of it, but ignore others. So this is a big challenge. My suggestion to everybody is to keep just producing as much, working hard, doing applied work, doing your research, doing your publications, and just keep pushing, because we don't have any other choice. We don't have any other way. And some of our ideas will be unpopular. I remember when I wrote this book, How Psychologists Failed, I had a number of colleagues really turn on me and say, well, we haven't failed. Why are you calling us failures? We have not failed. And they didn't like this title at all. But we have to keep going and trying to push people to understand that mainstream psychology at the moment is very, very limited. And people in the global South must not copy mainstream psychology just because they want higher status to be associated with something Western. They have to be more critical. And this is very important, especially for the young students coming through. And thank you, Tina, for your work. That's wonderful that you're doing that.
Yes, exactly. I always appreciate the work of psychologists in the Global South. And I know that there were some other questions also here, one related to the indigenous psychology, and the other one is whether we can somehow connect social work and psychology, because they obviously need some conversation. Would you like to address those questions? And then I would like to ask something in relation to Abrir and Global South researchers.
Sure. Could you tell me what the specific question is?
What do you think about indigenous psychology? That is one. And the other one is like, what you have so well described has been a concern of the social work field for over 100 years. Should the two professions seek some common conversation?
Yes, let me start with the social work issue. Unfortunately, we in academic life set up these artificial barriers between what we call disciplines. And it is a problem. It seems to me that there should not be a barrier between social work and psychology, because so much is shared across social work and psychology. I often have this problem in my everyday life in universities. For example, I published a book on Shakespeare and the experimental psychologist. And some of my colleagues were annoyed at this because they don't want psychology associated with the humanities. They want to stand out as a science. And in this book, Shakespeare and the Experimental Psychologist, I actually argued that in Shakespeare's plays, you can find psychology experiments. And in fact, he was, in many respects, experimental minded in his work. So, and I teach a very strange course called Psychology and Literature. Now, why should there be a gap between psychology and literature? People in literature are trying to understand behavior. We're trying to understand behavior. And of course, some psychologists are very annoyed at this because they say, oh, we're scientists. They're not scientists. We want to be as far away from them as possible. And I see this to be very narrow-minded and problematic. Let me put it another way. In 100 years' time, a lot of what psychology takes to be factual today will be regarded as nonsensical. Just as we look back on behaviorism and we say the behaviorists made so many fundamental mistakes, in 100 years, people will look back at our psychology and say, look how narrow-minded they were. They made so many mistakes. So it seems to me we need to be more broad-minded. We need to break down these disciplinary barriers. So that's in response to one question. The other question about indigenous psychology, I think as far as indigenous psychology gets psychologists in low-income countries to think about psychology critically and to critically reassess mainstream psychology, this is very good. However, one of the challenges I see is this overemphasis on differences. I have a book coming out in the next few months on multiculturalism, assimilation, and what I call omniculturalism. And the argument of the book is basically that instead of celebrating differences between groups, we should be celebrating human commonalities, because we're actually much more similar than we are different. And so as far as the focus on differences is concerned with indigenous psychology, I'm worried about that, because we're now in a situation where we're manufacturing more and more differences. I would rather see us focus on human commonalities and human rights. All humans having the same rights and duties. The human rights and duties must be shared irrespective of whether you're in North America, in South America, in Asia, wherever you are. We have the same human rights and duties. And we're much more similar than we are different. So it's the differences that worry me with respect to indigenous psychology, because my sense is that there is this tendency to manufacture differences and to socially construct and emphasize differences, where in reality I see us as much more similar than different. I, like you, I've been to many countries where I couldn't speak the local language, and yet I found I had a lot in common with people there, and we could communicate very quickly.
Of course, I would agree totally in terms of language and agreeing with people you don't speak their language while you don't speak their language. I had one question actually related to ABRERA, or consortium of psychologists and psychological researchers from the Global South, and our work. So as many of you know here, we are pretty young. We were established in 2022. We managed to get some grants till now, and we are doing some project now on open science and big team science, because that is a trend in psychology, but also because that is something that we would like psychologists from the Global South to get involved with. So I wanted to ask actually, because we like to talk there about the position of liminal researchers, those of us who were born and raised in the Global South, but are actually also partially or completely educated in the Global North, and we are now sometimes either back to the Global South, or we are like in the Global North, and how we can actually help connect the two worlds. Do you have any particular advice to us, or do you have anything to tell us, like how we should proceed in order to more like concentrate on similarities and not the differences?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, this is a long-standing challenge. And one of the problems we have is that we have very short memories. So when people think about this kind of problem, they think, okay, what's been done in the last 5 years? And some of you who are like me older, Tina will know this for sure, that this has been going on for decades. This challenge has been dealt with for decades, and there's lots of discussions around it. You know, what is appropriate psychology for the non-Western world? This question has been addressed for at least 40, 50 years. I remember people like Henri Tajfel addressing it 50, 60 years ago. So, you know, I started addressing it in the 1980s. So there is a history to this. And you shouldn't start as if you're starting from nothing. What I would suggest is, particularly through electronic communications, having more meetings where you connect people from different parts of the world to discuss this kind of issue. And you also are very frank in how you discuss it. For example, I often find that when I visit a non-Western country, people are shy to talk about status hierarchies. And just because somebody has a degree from the West or a particular university in the West, that shouldn't give them a status. And just because somebody's just been educated in the South shouldn't give them a different status. So these kinds of issues have to be really dealt with very frankly. And also the status hierarchies in journals. one of the great things that has happened is that now there are so many journals that you can find an outlet. And there are so many ways of publishing. You know, it didn't used to be like this. 40 years ago, it was much more difficult because you had to apply to certain journals and were very limited. So there are advantages that your generation have. And one of them is technology, that you can communicate with others all around the world. The second one is the multiplicity of journals. But you have to be frank, you have to be very critical, and you have to be ruthless in how you deal with this.
Thank you very much for that. That was very insightful, and we will take it into consideration for sure. I think Professor Montiel has another question.
It's actually an addition to what Ali said. It's in relation to your question, Alma, about Global South and the North. That Tajfel and et al. Years ago focused on cultural differences. Why the West and the non-West? Psychologists looked at things differently, and it was more like we are different, but we are. The assumption there was that we are different, but we are equal. When one looks at cultural differences, it doesn't say anything about inequalities, and I don't think so. But I think that the shift now is in the mindfulness of inequalities, even when there are collaborations between the North Atlantic psychologists and the Global South psychologists. Does the Global South psychologists end up only as a data collector? Is that the only role in methods and results? Does the what? Let me see what I'm sorry. Does the North Atlantic person stay as the theoretician in doing the framework? Then that doesn't shift the production of knowledge, the power of producing knowledge. It doesn't shift towards equality. So aside from just studying or working together, it is what is the intellectual contribution and their actual roles of equalities and inequalities when North Atlantic scholars and Global South scholars come together. I tell my students, I just remind them, one of my students is here, EJ Bulilan. I remind them, don't just accept to be a data collector. It's not gonna make you grow. Thank you.
Yes, the other suggestion I have is that your group work on trying to increase funding from the North for the South. And it seems to me the North owes it to the South to provide this funding.
Yeah, that is exactly one of the things that we would like to do. Yes, Professor Montiel, sorry.
I was so excited. Actually, Ali, I think you're also aware that even you yourself, you have difficulty finding funding for the questions you ask. And you are already a visible person in mainstream psychology. I mean, mainstream. The more Global South people are not going to get funding for the questions we want to ask. I think I can easily get funding from if I wanted to go into anti-terrorism. There are many offers, and from people who have funds. But not the kind of question. First of all, I don't. Yeah. Anyway, I'll not go into that. But if for us to be free to ask the questions that matter to the Global South, we can hope to get funds, but to be truthful, either we be truthful to our intellectual selves or we get funding. I think that right. It comes down to that.
Yes, I think that is also about the fact that, first of all, Nadia is from our executive committee board and one of the co-founders of BRIR, and she said there is no funding for the questions we want to ask. And that is exactly correct. So basically, like how we are working, we have to like why we started with big team science is also because we feel that we have been neglected over the years because we were used as data collectors, but we were never like asked to participate in like project writing or paper drafting or to provide our opinion on paper. What actually motivated me to establish Abrir was that I went to elementary school during the war. I was born in a country that doesn't exist anymore. I was born in Yugoslavia in 80s. So I didn't expect at that time that I will be growing up and getting education in the country that out of sudden ended up in the global south. And then I wanted actually to make some sort of a basis for future psychologists that they don't need to learn from photocopy textbooks as I did. And sometimes I didn't have money to afford photocopy, for instance. So we had only one maybe, and then a group of us was learning together. So that was one thing related to the social class and also like circumstances. What happened to us? We were not born as that. We were actually somehow drawn to that. So, and that is also one of the points that is very often neglected when we talk about culture and differences and also opportunities, you know, that some people were actually raised during the war, they were educated during the war or like some sort of other terrible circumstances like terrorism or so we are not really talking about it and taking it into consideration. You know, I am here where I am because probably I was also a bit more advantaged than other people that were in the same situation in my same country, Bosnia. So we are also aware of these differences between us who are raised and born in the global south. And many of us who are now like leading Abrir or like contributing to Abrir were a bit more advantaged, that, you know, had a bit more advantages in life than other who still cannot do it. So I think those are also some of the things that should be like taken into consideration when we are actually discussing like how we teach psychology and how we actually contribute to psychology and why somebody's approach is different than the other.
Yes.
I think here, since we are like, we don't really want to keep Professor Ali too long here because we know that his time is pretty limited and we very much appreciate that you devoted this part of your afternoon actually to us. I just want to, for now, like I think Diane had one last comment here regarding word on celebrating commonalities is finally being touched on the long-term developmental study by Waldinger, finding the essential importance for our mental and physical health is to maintain social connections and how this has helped students with multi-race income levels, etc. And USA Surgeon General also highly supportive of valuing and encouraging the importance of bringing at school, at workplace, schools, communities, etc. Especially important in integrating classroom and those with refugees, etc. So, and she said that she wrote an article on how to incorporate social connections via cooperative learning in schools, which is also, I think, important aspect.
Excellent. Yeah, I think that's a very good point. Well, thank you very much. I enjoyed the discussion.
Thank you very much. We all enjoyed it. And thank you to the audience and all of these questions and comments that you provided. Professor Ali, I hope we will see each other soon, either virtually or in person at some point. I wish you all a wonderful rest of the day or beginning of the day, depending on where you are. And hope to see you soon at some other event organized by either Abrir or Division 48 or together as we did this time.
Thank you very much. And if you're coming through Washington, D.C., please come and see me.
Yeah,
thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you.